All right, we are looking at the synoptic problem and looking at what is the solution. How are these synoptic gospels related? And we saw that there is a relationship. There's a lot of common material. And we looked at the idea that Mark was written first. But there are 235 verses that are common to Matthew and Luke, but do not appear in Mark. And so where did this come from? They must have had a common source, because at times the material is word for word. Scholars have proposed another document called Q. It comes from the German word Quelle, that means source. No one has ever seen Q. There is no document that we have called Q, but it's been proposed. So it's a hypothetical document. We don't really know if it existed, but it seems like it did. Now, there are a group of scholars, such as James Robinson, who believe that they can discover a development in Q as they look at the synoptic material. And they also say that there was a community that used only Q for their New Testament. Now, Q doesn't have the death and resurrection of Christ. And so they say that that wasn't important to these people. It was the sayings of Christ that was important. I really think that this kind of thing is more attributed to the imagination of these scholars than it is to reality. We can't really find different levels of Q or development of Q. Now, this is the two-source hypothesis, that we have Mark and we have Q. Matthew used Mark and Q, and Luke used Mark and Q. So at times there are passages that appear in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Those would be the passages that Matthew and Luke got from Mark. At times, there are passages that are only in Matthew and Luke. So that we would call Q material, that it came from Q. Now, there is also material in Matthew that is unique to Matthew. It doesn't appear in Mark or Luke. There's also material in Luke that is unique to Luke. It doesn't appear in Mark or Matthew. So we have what we call the four-document hypothesis. The material that is unique to Matthew we call M. And the material that is unique to Luke we call L. All right? So this basically says that Matthew and Luke use Mark and Q plus unique material. So as we read Matthew and we see verses there that appear not in Mark or Luke, we would say that is Matthew's unique material. And when we read Luke and we see material there that is not in Matthew or Mark, we would say that is Luke's unique material, or L. Okay, do you understand what we're saying here?
Can you explain it again, please, Doctor?
All right. All right. We have the Gospel of Mark. Okay, that's in the upper left corner here in your drawing. And we have another document called Q. Okay. And this four-document hypothesis says that Matthew got his material from Mark and Q, and also from another source called M. All right. Luke got his material from Mark in Q and another source called L. Now, M and L may not be a document. It may be oral material. It may be material gotten from other places. Luke tells us that he did research. So this is the 4-document hypothesis. Now, the 4-document hypothesis and the 2-document hypothesis are very similar. And for the sake of brevity, I am going to call both of them the 2-document hypothesis. But just remember, even when I say that, we may have the M and the L on the sides, okay? Okay, does everybody understand what we're saying here?
Excuse me, doctor.
Yes.
So we have Q, M, and L documents. So can we, who wrote it, doctor? Who
yes.
named the, yes.
We don't know.
Oh.
We don't know who wrote Q. And it may be that Q was not even a document. It may have been oral. Now, I think it was a document because Matthew and Luke are at times word for word. You know, when it appears only in Matthew and Luke, and we assume that it came from Q, at time it is word for word. Now, it's not very likely if it was oral. Okay, so it was probably a written document. And we don't know where M came from. It may have been a document. It may have been oral tradition that Matthew was familiar with. The same for L. So we don't know where that came from. But what we believe is that the Holy Spirit was inspiring Matthew, Mark, and Luke to write their Gospels as we have them. So the Holy Spirit was involved in this whole process. And we have before us then the Gospels that were inspired by the Holy Spirit. Okay, Tenney gives some weaknesses of the 2-source hypothesis. Number one, there may have been personal interaction by the compilers of the Gospels. So what if Mark and Luke associated with one another and shared their materials? Then that would be something that would go against then the 2-source hypothesis. There is no trace of the Q document. No trace of the Q document has been discovered. So it's only a hypothesis. There may be a Q document, there may not. We don't know. And Stein says that the biggest problem for Mark and priority is the existence of agreements of Matthew and Luke against Mark in the triple tradition. Now, by triple tradition, we mean a verse that appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all 3 synoptic gospels. The double tradition would be it appears in Matthew and Luke. Okay, so when Matthew and Luke have something similar, they have something that is also in Mark, but Matthew and Luke disagree with Mark, then that may give evidence that the 2 or 4 document hypothesis doesn't work. Let me give you an example. Here, Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22. Let's just read it in Matthew. Then they spat in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Messiah. Who is it that struck you?" Now in Luke, we have the very same question being asked by those who blindfolded and beat Jesus, but it does not appear in Mark. How can we explain this if we use the two document hypothesis? Now, here, Matthew and Luke agree against Mark. These are generally called minor agreements, but the proponents of other theories consider them major agreements. And there are a lot of these places where Matthew and Luke agree, against Mark in the triple tradition when all three gospels have it. Okay, so this is our first proposal, first possible solution to the synoptic problem. It's the two document hypothesis. Now, the majority of scholars accept the two document hypothesis. All right. So that is the most popular of the theories. Let's go to the second theory, the Farrar hypothesis, or it's also called the Farrar-Goulder-Goodacre hypothesis, or Lucan posteriority. And you see the diagram here. Mark is original, Matthew used Mark, and then Luke used Matthew. This hypothesis says that Mark was written first, Matthew used Mark, and that Luke used Mark and Matthew. It has also been called Markan priority without Q. Okay, by Markan priority, we mean Mark was written first. In the 1950s, Austin Farrar proposed this theory. It was expanded in the 1980s by Michael Goulder, and today its biggest proponent is Mark Goodacre, professor of New Testament at Duke University. And Mark Goodacre writes a lot about this, and it's all saying that there was no such thing as Q. Now, it's based on two things. Number one, Luke used Matthew, and number two, Q did not exist. All right. It emphasizes the minor agreements of Matthew and Luke against Mark, and says that there is evidence of Luke's use of Matthew, but not Matthew's use of Luke. So we have Mark, Matthew used Mark, and then Luke used Mark and Matthew. So there's no need for Q here if that is the way it happened. So both the two document hypothesis and the Farrar hypothesis are based on Markan priority. Mark was written first. All right. Everybody understand? Understand what we're saying?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So, Doctor,
Hypothesis.
excuse me, Doctor.
Yes.
So that is the way we see the unique of four gospel.
I'm sorry.
I mean,
what was that now?
that is the way we see the united of the four gospels.
What is the way that we see the what of the four gospels?
The united, the united. Is that right, Doctor?
You're breaking up there, and I couldn't hear too well. So say it again.
Yes. So that is the way we see the united of four gospels.
Some people see it that way. Of the three gospels, the three synoptic gospels.
Sir, I have question.
Yes. All right.
If Mark is like a priority in the gospel, why the book of Matthew come first?
Why does the book of Matthew what?
Uh, come they put in the first one in the first book in the
Oh,
New
okay.
Testament.
Okay. Why does it come first in the New
Yeah.
Testament? Yeah. Many people in the early church, I would say second and third century, believed that Matthew was written first. And generally the church believed that until like the 1800s. So we're going to look at some theories that see Matthew as being written first. So I think at the end, we'll have a better perspective on that question. Okay?
Oh, okay. Okay, sir.
Okay. Okay, let's go to the two gospel hypothesis, or the Griesbach hypothesis. Now here, it says that Matthew was written first, that Luke used Matthew, and then that Mark used Luke and Matthew. So Matthew, Luke used Matthew, Mark then used Matthew and Luke and condensed what was there. Around the year 1800, Johann Jacob Griesbach proposed a theory that Matthew was the basis for Luke. Mark then used Matthew and Luke to write his gospel. More recently, in the 1960s, William Farmer proposed the same hypothesis. He said that Matthew wrote first, then Luke used Matthew and his own unique sources in writing his gospel, and Mark was a condensation of Matthew and Luke. But where Matthew and Mark have material in common, it is not Mark that condenses. And why would Mark delete the important parts of Matthew, like the Sermon on the Mount, and the important parts of Luke, like the Sermon on the Plain, and in both Matthew and Luke, the infancy narratives, and also we might add the great parables that appear in Luke, the parable of the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son. What about the post-resurrection appearances? Why would those not be carried over? So it doesn't seem logical that Mark would deliberately leave out what seems to be the most important parts of Matthew and Luke. Now, again, like the Farrer hypothesis, the two gospel hypothesis has no need for Q. The identical passages in Matthew and Luke are explained by Luke's use of Matthew. We might also add that the early church also believed that Matthew was the first gospel. So this hypothesis has some external evidence in support. Okay? If that's true, then why did Mark want to make a short version of the gospel? The hypothesis says that there are apparent contradictions in Matthew and Luke, and Mark wanted to smooth them out for the sake of inquirers who may be turned away by the idea of a contradiction. Okay? So that is what the two gospel hypothesis says, or the Griesbach hypothesis. That Matthew wrote first, then Luke used Matthew, and Mark used both Luke, and Matthew. Do you have questions here? Comments? All right. The orality and memory hypothesis, or what's called the theory of oral tradition. One version of this theory says that each of the gospel writers wrote down what they heard orally. Matthew took his own notes directly from Jesus. Mark reproduced the stories of Peter about Jesus, and Luke reproduced the preaching of Paul. Certainly, there were accounts of Jesus' life that circulated orally before they were written. But this theory doesn't seem to square with the facts of the interrelationship between the books. First of all,